In the autumn of 1929, as panic spread through Wall Street and stock prices collapsed in New York, Britain appeared, at least on the surface, composed and untouched. There were no screaming traders in London, no crowds gathering outside banks, no immediate sense that catastrophe had arrived. To many observers, Britain looked insulated from the chaos. After all, this was the nation that had ruled global finance for centuries. The pound sterling was still a world currency. The City of London still spoke with authority. British politicians reassured the public that this was an American problem, another speculative excess across the Atlantic that would burn itself out. But beneath that calm exterior, Britain was already breaking. The Great Depression did not arrive in Britain in 1929. It had been waiting there for years, embedded in its economy, hidden inside its industries, locked into its currency system, and buried under the pride of an empire that refused to accept its own decline. While other nations entered the Depression from a position of strength, Britain entered it exhausted, indebted, and structurally crippled. Its economy had never recovered from the First World War. Its industrial heartlands were already dying. Its financial system was frozen by outdated ideology, and its leaders were clinging to the illusion that prestige could substitute for productivity. When global trade collapsed, Britain had nothing left to cushion the blow. The crisis did not expose weakness, it revealed it. Factories that had survived on thin margins collapsed overnight. Coal mines closed, shipyards went silent. Entire towns lost their economic purpose in a matter of months. And unlike the United States or Germany, Britain lacked the political flexibility and the will to respond. This is the story of why the Great Depression cut deeper in Britain than almost anywhere else. Not because Britain was unlucky, but because Britain had spent a decade engineering its own vulnerability. And when the storm finally arrived, the empire discovered that power without adaptability is just another form of fragility. By the time the Great Depression began, Britain was already living with a chronic economic illness. The crash of 1929 did not strike a healthy system, it struck one that had never healed from the last war. The First World War had fundamentally altered Britain's economic position. Before 1914, Britain had been the world's workshop, exporter, banker, and insurer. After 1918, it was a debtor nation, weighed down by war loans, pensions, and the cost of maintaining a global empire it could no longer afford. Its traditional industries, coal steel, shipbuilding, and textiles were already in long-term decline. These sectors had powered Britain's rise in the 19th century, but by the 1920s they were obsolete, inefficient, and facing fierce competition from newer producers in the United States, Germany, and Japan. British factories were older, smaller, and slower to modernize. Productivity lagged, but wages remained politically sensitive. Instead of adapting, Britain tried to preserve the past. Millions of workers in the industrial North were trapped in industries with no future. Entire regions depended on a single employer, a single product, or a single export market. When demand softened, there was no alternative work to absorb the shock. At the same time, Britain's economy was dangerously unbalanced. The South, especially London, was dominated by finance, services, and administration. The North depended on heavy industry. When global trade slowed, the North collapsed first, and there was no internal engine of growth to compensate. Unemployment was already high throughout the 1920s, never falling below 1 million. For many British families, the Depression was not a sudden disaster, was the worsening of a permanent condition. This meant that when the global economy finally seized up, Britain had no reserves of strength to draw upon. There was no industrial dynamism, no consumer boom, no technological surge waiting to offset the downturn. The crash did not knock Britain off its feet, it pushed a weakened body into complete collapse. At the heart of Britain's suffering during the Great Depression was a single catastrophic decision, remaining tied to the gold standard long after it had become a liability. The gold standard fixed the value of the British pound to a specific amount of gold. In theory, this system promised stability, trust, and financial discipline. In reality, during an economic crisis, it became a straitjacket. By staying on gold, Britain surrendered control over its own economy. When demand collapsed after 1929, countries needed flexibility. They needed to lower interest rates, expand credit, and devalue their currencies to make exports cheaper and stimulate growth. Britain could do none of these things without risking a run on its gold reserves. Every economic decision was subordinated to one goal: defending the pound. To maintain confidence in sterling, the Bank of England kept interest rates high. This made borrowing expensive. At the exact moment, businesses needed cheap credit to survive. Factories closed, not because demand vanished entirely, but because they could not finance operations through the downturn. Deflation became official policy. Prices fell, wages were cut, and unemployment benefits were slashed whole in the name of sound money. But deflation increased the real burden of debt, crushed consumption, and locked the economy into a downward spiral. Workers earned less, spent less, and lost jobs faster. Other nations learned faster. The United States abandoned gold in 1933. Britain's dominions, like Canada and Australia, left earlier. Once free from gold, these economies could breathe. Again, currencies adjusted, exports recovered, and growth resumed. Britain, by contrast, clung to gold out of pride and fear. Political leaders believed leaving gold would destroy Britain's credibility forever. They imagined inflation, chaos, and national humiliation. Instead, their refusal prolonged mass unemployment and deepened regional misery. The gold standard did not protect Britain. It quietly drained the life out of its economy, turning a global downturn into a national catastrophe. As the Depression tightened its grip, Britain responded in a way that deepened the suffering. It chose austerity when the country needed relief. Government leaders believed the crisis was a moral test rather than an economic failure. Balanced budgets, they argued, were a matter of national honor. Spending cuts were framed as responsibility. Pain was presented as discipline. So instead of stimulating the economy, Britain withdrew support from it. Public spending was reduced. Infrastructure projects were delayed or canceled. Social programs were cut back precisely when millions depended on them to survive. Unemployment benefits, the last lifeline for entire communities, were slashed to reassure international lenders that Britain would meet its obligations. The logic was cruelly circular. Cuts reduced demand. Reduced demand caused more layoffs. More layoffs increased welfare costs, prompting further cuts. The economy contracted not because resources were exhausted, but because fear dominated policy. For families in the industrial North, this translated into daily hardship. Men stood in long queues outside labor exchanges, knowing there were no jobs to be found. Children grew up malnourished. Entire towns existed on relief payments that barely covered food, let alone dignity. Meanwhile, the south of England told a different story. London's financial district remained relatively stable. Middle-class suburbs expanded modestly. This uneven experience allowed policymakers to underestimate the scale of the disaster. Britain appeared functional from the capital even as vast regions quietly collapsed. Unlike the United States, Britain rejected large-scale public works. There was no equivalent of the New Deal, no massive state-led employment program to absorb the unemployed and modernize infrastructure. The government feared debt more than decay. Austerity was supposed to restore confidence. Instead, it destroyed resilience. By trying to appear strong in financial markets, Britain weakened the real foundations of its economy: labor, industry, and social cohesion. The country survived the Depression not through recovery, but through endurance. And endurance left scars. Britain entered the Great Depression burdened by something that was supposed to be an advantage: its empire. For decades, the empire had been presented as an economic shield, vast network of colonies supplying raw materials, markets for British goods, and prestige that underpinned global influence. In reality, by the 1930s, the empire offered far less protection than policymakers believed. Global trade collapsed after 1929 as demand shrank. Colonial markets could not absorb British exports at previous levels. Many colonies were themselves impoverished and dependent on commodity exports whose prices had fallen dramatically. They had little purchasing power and few incentives to buy expensive British goods. Worse still, Britain's commitment to free trade left it exposed. While other nations turned inward, raising tariffs, protecting domestic industries, and reshaping trade, Britain hesitated. Free trade had once been the cornerstone of British strength. Abandoning it felt like abandoning national identity. But in a world of collapsing demand, free trade became a vulnerability. Cheap foreign goods flowed into Britain, undercutting struggling domestic producers. British industries, already weakened by deflation and an overvalued currency, found themselves competing without protection at the worst possible moment. The empire could not compensate for this imbalance. Shipping lanes, colonial administrations, and overseas commitments drained resources rather than generating growth. Maintaining imperial infrastructure consumed money Britain no longer had, while offering little relief to unemployed workers at home. Even psychologically, the empire became a burden. It sustained the illusion that Britain remained a global giant, discouraging urgent reform. Policymakers clung to imperial prestige instead of confronting economic reality. This delayed decisive action and prolonged stagnation. By the early 1930s, Britain was an imperial power without imperial insulation, exposed to global shocks, restricted by outdated policy, and unable to leverage its empire as a meaningful economic buffer. The empire remained vast, but its ability to protect Britain during crisis had quietly evaporated. Britain did eventually emerge from the Great Depression, but its recovery was slower, weaker, and more uneven than that of many other major economies. The reasons lay not only in the shock of the crisis, but in the long shadow of choices made before and during it. First, Britain exited the Depression without transforming its economic foundations. Leaving the gold standard in 1931 brought immediate relief. The pound depreciated, exports became more competitive, and interest rates fell. A modest recovery followed, particularly in housing, consumer goods, and light manufacturing in the south of England. But this recovery bypassed the regions that had suffered most. The industrial north remained trapped. Coal, steel, shipbuilding, and textiles never regained their former importance. Years of underinvestment had left factories obsolete. Skilled workers had been unemployed for so long that communities hollowed out. Even when demand returned, much of British industry could not respond competitively. Second, Britain prioritized stability over transformation. Unlike the United States or Germany, Britain avoided aggressive state-led industrial restructuring. The government feared inflation, debt, and political instability more than stagnation. As a result, recovery relied heavily on private credit and consumption rather than long-term modernization. This produced growth, but shallow growth. The South prospered, new suburbs expanded, consumer industries thrived. But regional inequality hardened into permanence. Britain emerged from the Depression as two economies sharing one flag. Finally, the social damage lingered. Years of unemployment had eroded trust in institutions. Communities that had been sacrificed to defend financial orthodoxy did not forget. Political extremism did not take power in Britain, but resentment reshaped public life and weakened national cohesion. Britain survived the Great Depression, but it did not truly heal from it. The crisis exposed a deeper truth. Nations that refuse to adapt in hard times do not collapse dramatically. They decline quietly, carrying the costs forward for generations. The Great Depression did not merely damage Britain's economy. It rewrote Britain's understanding of power, stability, and responsibility. For decades, British leaders had believed that financial credibility was the foundation of national strength. A strong currency, balanced budgets, and investor confidence were treated as moral virtues. During the Depression, these beliefs were tested and found wanting. Britain learned painfully that an economy exists to serve people, not symbols. Defending the pound at all costs protected balance sheets while destroying livelihoods. Austerity preserved appearances while hollowing out communities. Imperial prestige delayed reform while unemployment became permanent for millions. None of these choices caused instant collapse. Instead, they produced a long, quiet erosion. The most tragic realization came after the crisis passed. When Britain finally abandoned the gold standard, the feared apocalypse never arrived. Inflation did not spiral. Social order did not dissolve. In fact, recovery began almost immediately. The suffering of the early 1930s had not been necessary, it had been policy-driven. This realization reshaped economic thinking. The Depression discredited the gold standard forever. It elevated the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, who argued that governments must act during crisis spending when private demand collapses, protecting employment rather than punishing it. These lessons would shape the post-war world and prevent depressions of similar scale for decades. But for Britain, the lesson came too late. The damage had already been done. Industrial decline had hardened. Regional inequality had become structural. The financial exhaustion of the 1930s left Britain ill-prepared for the next catastrophe, the Second World War. The Great Depression did not end the British Empire, but it broke its economic spine. From that point forward, Britain would no longer set the rules of the global system. It would adapt to one shaped elsewhere. And that is why the Great Depression hit Britain harder than almost anyone else, not because it suffered the most dramatic collapse, but because it revealed a nation clinging to yesterday's power in a world that had already moved on.